Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start with something actually really fun. We have a video we're going to show. My colleague Ben Watson, who's our news editor and puts out our morning email called The Debrief, he put this together. I had the opportunity a couple weeks ago to fly in an F-15, which was probably the coolest and most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life. And you'll see from the video some of the stuff that we did and kind of a little bit about the story that we told from that trip. So anyway, there you go. So do you miss flying planes now that?
I miss flying well. It looks like you were flying well. By the way, I don't know if you knew, but we have a little pilot shortage, so this Defense One thing didn't work out for you.
Well, when was the last time you got a chance to fly?
Afghanistan. Actually, when I was deployed there as the Air Component Commander, I actually flew in the MC-12, which is a King Air that we had modified to do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance work. So I actually was flying combat missions just a few years ago. So
I'm more current than you right now?
You are more current than I am. That's exactly right. Well done.
Well, General Goldfein, thanks so much for coming and being part of this.
Yeah, thank you.
You've just written a kind of an op-ed for us. It's on our website, defense1.com. It's, I think, the most read story on our site right now. And it kind of talks about the Air Force's role in the future of war. And I was just hoping you can maybe just kind of give us some of your thoughts there.
Yeah, so the idea here was really to set the stage for a dialogue, really, about the future of combined arms and joint warfare, not only as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, but perhaps more importantly as a member of the Joint Chiefs. And to talk about what's changed and what hasn't changed. And what hasn't changed over time is this idea of trust and confidence as a foundation for being able to do joint warfare. And it's my belief that coming out of 25 years of continual warfare, we actually have trust and confidence built to a level that has set the table really for us to do some really evolutionary work in the future. And I talk about it at the tactical, the operational, and the strategic levels, because we as the force services and the Coast Guard have been fighting now for a quarter of a century together. And so whether you want to talk about airmen embedded in Army and Marine Corps units, whether you want to talk about Naval and Marine Corps units and Coast Guard working maritime operations, we've been doing this now for so long that trust and confidence has truly been established. So the question is, as we go into the information age of warfare, which in many ways we're already in, what does the future look like? And I think, and we're all the service chiefs that are really thinking of this in very similar ways, it's going to be far more about networks. It's going to be far more about how do you take all of the information that you collect and turn that into decision quality information faster than any adversary could ever counter? And how do you create effects across domains to the point where you've got operational agility? And that combination of operational agility and decision speed produces a deterrent value that nobody can counter. And so that's the dialogue that we're all having going forward.
It's kind of, what's the speed like now? You were recently just a few years out of being the commander of Air Force Central Command, so overseeing the air operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Kind of how long does it take you now to make those decisions, and how long is it going to take us to get to where you want to actually be?
So I would say today we're faster than anyone else, but far too slow for the future. And so if I was standing on what we call the catwalk, or looking down on the floor of my headquarters, deployed forward, what you would see would be individual cells that were operating. The space cell, that was doing all of the collecting, the monitoring, gaining information from space. Right next to that cell would be the personnel recovery cell. And they would be doing all of the work associated with orchestrating and ensuring that we could do personnel recovery. And then you'd have a battlefield coordination detachment, 60 soldiers who would be working around the clock, ensuring that everything we were doing in air, space, and cyber, and all the components was all connected to the ground force commander and ground maneuver. And if you were to look below their feet, what you would see is that each one of those cells was bought through proprietary software development, and the data is formatted in a certain way. And if you look below their feet, you would see these gateways, right, that we build to try to share the information.
This is why they have like 4, 6 screens in front of them.
Well, no, actually, the 4 or 6 screens is how the information comes together. But the future has got to be a common operating system. The future has got to be such that we're sharing data so fast, and we're able to actually use some of the third offset technologies to get away from the human analysis that we're doing very much today. I would argue very much along the lines of industrial age kind of intelligence assessment. And we got to get into the next stage, which is some of that machine-to-machine, human-machine teaming, artificial intelligence, and how do you take all of the data that you take, and that turns that into decision quality information, and then you act.
Are you experimenting with anything now, or
We are.
using anything?
As a matter of fact, we've got an experiment going on right now called Data to Decision, and it's experimenting with just that. What if you were to take, in a multi-domain approach, information into one common operating system? How quickly could you then turn that into decision quality information? And so we're going through that right now.
Is that being used in theater, or?
No, this is an experiment we're actually doing here within the Air Force, but we're doing it also across the joint team.
Sticking on ops a little bit, you've been using F-22 now in Syria for 2 years. New plane, does a lot more. It's kind of been described to me as the quarterback in a lot of ways. I imagine that helps when you bring something in like that. It kind of changes the ConOps and the way you operate, and I suspect the F-35 is going to change your ConOps as well. How do you go about doing that, and how do you go about actually rewriting the ConOps? How much time does something like that actually take? And
Well,
how do you go about doing it?
Yeah, so we actually have some of the highest level training that we do, both training and testing, we do out at Nellis Air Force Base at the Red Flag exercises. And in the op-ed, I actually shared a scenario of a recent mission that we did out there with an F-35B on its debut sortie. And there was a fight that was going on in cyber, and there was a fight that was going on in space. All that was happening long before aircraft even came off the tanker. And the information from those fights that were going on was actually being fed into the F-35B and displayed in a way, and this is again an example of machine-to-machine and human-machine teaming. It's being displayed in the visor and on the displays and in the command and control headquarters in a way that the F-35 pilot is actually calling audibles real time based on the information that he's being presented. And so as we go into those kinds of exercises, that's the way we develop ConOps, and it's a continual evolution. We actually never stop.
You talk a bit in the op-ed also about allies and bringing allies on board. You know, I know, again, to point back to your experience in the Middle East, we talk a lot about information sharing, specifically when it comes to missile defense, and kind of I guess what you hear from the allies from time to time is just or what you hear from the scuttlebutt is there's a hesitance always among them to share their information. So how do you get by that?
Well, first of all, we got to continually remind ourselves that the strategy that we're executing in most of the areas that we're looking at across the globe is by, with, and through allies and partners. It's actually one of the great national strengths that we have, and when you compare it to our potential adversaries or competitors, it's not something that they can show as a strength. So if we're going to be able to use that as a great strength, it means we've got to be able to figure out a way to share information. And that's both ways. One of the challenges we face is that as technology has grown over time, with technology often comes increased security levels. And what you're often trying to protect is sources and methods of getting the information, not the information itself. And so some of this is going to be more cultural than technological. Because if the approach you take is risk averse, and you start asking the question, what can I share? It doesn't take long in that discussion before someone says nothing. It's the wrong question for the future. The right question for now and in the future is, what can't I share and why? And show me why I can't share that. Because again, going back to the strategy that has been laid out by the Secretary and the Commander-in-Chief, it's by, with, and through allies and partners, and that's a great national strength that we've got to leverage.
I want to stay in the Middle East for just one more question. Talk about Operation Inherent Resolve, the airstrike campaign that's been going on against ISIS for the last two plus years. How long is just from an Air Force perspective, how are your airmen and how's your equipment doing, and how long is the current pace that we're at sustainable?
So right now, I'll tell you that we are fully engaged there. We've launched over 2,000 sorties just in the last month alone in terms of just what we've been flying. And you take a look at the operations, it's both a challenge and opportunity that this campaign, again, to our last question, it's by, with, and through. So we are actually working with Iraqi security forces at the pace that they're able to go in. Talk about the Mosul campaign. So we're working with the Iraqi security forces, providing precision air power and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and command and control, and all those things that the air component brings to the fight. We're doing that with and for the coalition. One of the challenges, and again, it's both a challenge, I think, and an opportunity, is that we go to war with our values. And the expectation of not only our coalition partners and those who invite us in, and the American people, is that we do everything we can to be as precise as we can be. One of my favorite quotes from Hap Arnold, who was the commander of Army Air Corps and Air Forces during World War II, he said during the worst days of the daylight bombing campaign, when we were losing a high percentage of bombers, he said, the problem with air power is we make it look too easy. I sort of wonder what Hap would think right now, because the reality is, sometimes we tend to focus on the end game, which is a bomb that goes into its intended location. We don't look at everything that happened before that, to collect the pattern of light, to get the intelligence, to ensure that we validated the target, to ensure that we know where the friendlies are, to ensure that we know exactly where the enemy is, to ensure that we do all those things, that we collect the battle damage assessment afterwards, that we know what we've hit. When I grew up flying F-16s, the pilot's prayer was, please God, let me find my target and not let my buddies down. It's changed. In precision warfare, in the information age, it's please God, let me hit the right target and not let my buddies down. Because I'm going to hit what I aim at with 98% accuracy.
Do you feel like right now there's a better, it certainly seems from an outsider's perspective, there's a better appreciation, say now, for air power than there was maybe even 10 years ago, that they're just within the joint community?
I think so, and I think it is because you got to look beyond, because we're fully engaged in the current fight. But let's go to what you just did in the F-15. So as we sit here speaking, you've got folks like you flew with in the four corners of the United States who are on strip alert, who will scramble to do homeland defense. You've got folks out there that are fully engaged in air, space, and cyber, fully engaged in Europe, right, to provide a deterrent to Russia. You've got fully engaged in the Pacific. And when I talk about what the air component brings, you got to think of it beyond just what we're doing in the flying business. Any of you who are now operating on a cell phone, if you check and see that you've got a GPS signal, that's been brought to you by 1,000 airmen right now who are flying the GPS constellation that provides precision navigation and timing for the globe. Whether you want to talk about, global vigilance or reach or power, what the air component brings to the joint team and what brings to as part of the joint team and brings to the joint force has really become like oxygen, right? And like oxygen, when you got it, you don't even think about it. But when you don't have it, that's all you think about.
Let's pivot real quick. You mentioned that there's F-15s again. The kind of the premise of the story was kind of what the Air Force has a decision to make. So kind of when you look at the future of air superiority right now, what does it look like?
Well, I'll tell you, when I look at and think about, the Maslow's hierarchy of what an air component does for the nation, it starts with ensuring that anywhere on the globe when called upon, we can first gain control of and then exploit the air domain. That's evolving into air and space domain. And so first and foremost, if you're going to do vigilance, if you're going to do reach, if you're going to do power, if you're going to do extended maritime activity, you're going to do surface warfare, you got to get air superiority. So this is an obligation that the Air Force has. It's one of our 5 core missions that we received in 1947, and it hasn't changed and it won't change for the future. So we got to continue to evolve. And as we think about this in the 21st century, and as we think about this in the information age of warfare, I'm hoping we can reset the dialogue a little bit. Because we have to start thinking about this beyond a platform-centric dialogue. F-15C, F-35, F-22, not one of those weapon systems is ever going to fight by itself. Every one of those is going to be part of a network. Every one of those has got to fit into a network that's got a common operating system that shares that information in all of these domains that we collect information: air, land, sea, space, cyber. I would add subsurface almost as a separate domain just to make sure we don't forget about it. How do you take all that information and put it into a common operating system, turn that into decision quality information, and then be able to create effects from those same domains at a pace that the enemy can never keep up with? So not only do you overwhelm the adversary, but you also create redundancy and reliability and resiliency in the system so that if one area is taken out, you can take them on in another area. And when you add all that together, to me, it equals deterrence in the 21st century. So air superiority is always going to be foundational to that.
You just were in the Pacific, an area where all those domains are clearly key. Talk about a little bit about what you were doing there. You were there during the election. What were kind of questions were airmen asking you and allies asking you kind of maybe about the election, just in general, kind of what they were asking?
Well, I'll tell you that overall, I actually was leaving the Pacific when the actual election results came out. When I was there, the overwhelming message that I was getting from them was is the importance of the alliance. And I only spent time in Korea and Japan. And I wanted to spend time there because I really needed to spend time going to all the bases over there and seeing, my airmen in action and getting a chance to talk to them. I did get a couple of questions from airmen at all calls when we would get all gather about the election, and actually it was a great opportunity for me to reinforce for us that we take a solemn oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we do that without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and we do that regardless of what's going on politically at the time. And this is actually an important opportunity for us to reinforce that for the American people, that it's the United States military by design is apolitical. So as a chief and as a member of the JCS, I'm going to provide my best military advice on anything I'm asked about, regardless of what particular political party happens to be in power.
We had a pre-summit event with Admiral Harris from PACOM just earlier in the week, and he talked a lot about strengthening the bond between the United States, Japan, and Korea, kind of trilaterally. Did you talk at all about that and kind of what kind of ways, I guess, can we deepen our relationship trilaterally with them.
We did, and it was actually on the minds. And so I spent time. I actually got to spend a little time with Prime Minister Abe and the Minister of Defense there in Japan, and got to see my counterparts, the commander of the Kukajetai, which is the Japanese Air Defense Force, and also the Korean Air Force as well. And so we spent a lot of time talking about not only our bilateral relationship, but the ongoing dialogue of a trilateral relationship and the neighborhood they live in relative to an unpredictable North Korea and a more aggressive China. And so, just to give you one data point, so in Japan, they shared that they're on track to actually have the most number of intercepts of Chinese and Russian aircraft in their history this year on the current path. So there's a significant amount of concern there, and so therein leads why their message to me was the importance of us standing with them. And therein lies why my message to them was, we stand with you. And so not only do we as an air component have aircraft, have air, space, cyber, extended deterrence that reaches back in here into the homeland, that we have committed to this alliance, but to reinforce for them that we're with them. And so that message was well received, and we had some good dialogues about not only the relationship, but also the interoperability, which ties into the multi-domain command control networks. How do we do information sharing? All of that plays into this as we go forward in the future.
Does the U.S. support those intercepts?
Right now, it depends. Probably we don't generally when it comes to the Japanese intercepts,
right,
because they are protecting their sovereign airspace.
Sure.
And so therefore that is a sovereign Japanese mission that they do.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you've stressed that you want to do is kind of revitalize the squadron. And I apologize if I'm not characterizing it correctly, but I'll keep it pretty broad like that.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about there in terms of that? And I also want to tie that to, I interviewed General Rice, the Guard Director, a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he talked about, in terms of aircraft-wise, as more fifth-gen aircraft come in and the active duty kind of gets more planes, how it would help some of those planes that have some life left in them to possibly go into the Guard. So maybe you could talk about both those issues.
Yeah, so tomorrow, on Friday, about 850 young men and women will raise their right hand and become airmen at Lackland Air Force Base. And if you haven't been out there, now that you're an Eagle pilot,
I have not. Not a joke. My fiance is actually there. Was there yesterday.
Oh, so. Great! All right. Is she going through?
She's writing. She writes about the Air Force as well.
Oh, good.
So she's there.
Well, tell her to go out there on a Friday afternoon and go see that, because it's something to behold. Because you have the finest. I mean, this is the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal. Young men and women who sign up to serve a nation who's executing combat operations. They know exactly what they're getting into, and they're all volunteers. And then when they get done with their training, they will go on to technical school, and we will teach them a trade. And when they get done with that trade, they will go to a squadron. And that's where we're going to infuse into them the culture of what it means to be an airman. And so I'd like to talk about it relative not to a flying squadron, but let's talk about this as in a space squadron, or a missile squadron up in Minot would be another great example. They're going to get to that squadron, and that's where we're going to mold them. We're going to groom them. That's where they're going to thrive. That's where families are going to thrive. That's where we're going to create readiness. That's where the mission of the United States Air Force is going to succeed or fail. It is the most important level of command and leadership in our Air Force. It's actually the last time when your unit is small enough where you get to know them individually, and every airman that you get to know has a story, and you affect their lives in a very personal way. And so this focus on revitalizing squadrons is to recognize across the Air Force that is the heartbeat of the Air Force. And if we can get that piece right, both from a resource perspective and from a cultural perspective, in terms of making sure that airmen and families thrive in that part of our Air Force in terms of the command structure, then we'll get a lot right. I will tell you that I have the blessing, the luxury, as I've come in and taken a fresh assessment of my service as a service chief. I'm able to do this as an evolution, not a revolution. So this is going to be a 4-year effort that we're going to look at, which is what, in fact, does a 21st century squadron of the United States Air Force need to look like? It may look different than what it has in the past because the mission's changed. We've grown entire enterprises. I mean, think about it. The ISR enterprise, the cyber enterprise, the space enterprise with space as a contested place, they didn't exist the way they do now 15 years ago. So as we've grown mission over time, we've also gotten as smaller than we've ever gotten as an Air Force. If I was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force in 1990, when we deployed for Desert Shield, I'd be talking to an Air Force of just shy of 1 million active Guard, Reserve, and civilians. Today, I'm talking to a force of 660,000 total. So we've gotten a lot smaller over time. If I'd been talking to an Air Force in 1990, I would have looked at an Air Force that had 134 fighter squadrons from which we deployed 34 forward for Desert Shield. Today's Air Force has a grand total, active Guard and Reserve, grand total 55. So that story has got to be told that we have gotten so small over time while we've grown enterprise and we've actually now increased mission over time. And so the question I'm asking as a new chief is, what's that done to the squadron over time? And our squadrons resourced for the mission that we've given them in the 21st century. And so we're going to be focused on this for the next 4 years.
Well, we're out of time, but hopefully we'll have you back next year at the Defense One Summit, and we'll check up on you and see how you're doing.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.